Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Zuckerman, president of the Century Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us for today's event, and a special thank you to our esteemed panelists and moderator, and to our host, NYU Wagner. The Century Foundation is a progressive, independent think tank that drives policy change to make people's lives better. We pursue economic, racial, and gender equity in education, healthcare, and work. At TCF, we believe that public policy is an essential tool to expand opportunity and ensure justice for all. We also know that policy cannot be blind to our history. Sadly, this history includes the stain of slavery, racism, and white supremacy. We see this legacy enduring today in all facets of life, from countless killings of unarmed Black men and women, vast racial disparities in healthcare, to a Black and white wealth gap of roughly 10 to 1, just to name a few. In order to advance racial justice and equity today, we must address inequities and inequalities of our past. That's why I'm so looking forward to today's panel, where we will get into the weeds on how to implement reparations in America. It's a conversation that's frankly long overdue. And based on the overwhelming interest we received at this event, it's one that people are more than ready to have. With that, I'd like to introduce Sherry Gleed, my friend and Dean of NYU Wagner School of Public Service. Sherry, over to you.
I'm Sherry Gleed, Dean of NYU Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service. I am so delighted to be partnering once again with the Century Foundation to advance our conversations about key issues in public service. In today's conversations, we're going to discuss getting to the root of the Black-white wealth gap. That gap perpetuates systemic racism. And we're going to talk about how the implementation of reparations can help address this crisis. I want to welcome our moderator, Danielle Belton, editor-in-chief at The Root, and welcome our speakers, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, Chief Race, Wealth, and Community at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and Keith Young, a city councilman in Asheville, North Carolina. During the event, you can submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button on your screen. A recording of today's event will be made available 48 hours after the event on both the tcf.org and NYU Wagner YouTube pages. And now to kick us off, I'd like you to welcome our keynote speaker, Representative Barbara Lee.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, let me just say how honored I am to be with NYU Wagner's and the Century Foundation, and for today's panel, talking about what is so critical in terms of where we are in our country as it relates to systemic racism and the historical context for how we got to this point. And that, of course, is reparations. And so I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here today, and just know that I truly believe that we're at this pivotal point in our history when we need to acknowledge and to really understand how systemic racism has truly been built into our society for the last 401 years, and all of the insidious ways that it remains part of every aspect of our life. I always say systemic racism is part of the DNA of the United States. Inequality is at the heart of every crisis that we're dealing with right now. And of course, here we have the United States, of course, the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world, yet our poverty rates continue to eclipse most industrialized nations, disproportionately impacting communities of color. Make no mistake, 401 years of systemic racism, oppression, Jim Crow, the Black codes, the lack of access to voting rights. We have a system in this country which perpetuates white supremacy. And that's why I'm so pleased that Congresswoman Jackson Lee has supported and introduced H.R. 40, which of course is the bill to establish a commission to study, but also to develop reparations. I have H.R. 100, which is legislation that would establish a commission on truth, racial healing, and transformation, which many countries around the world, actually over 40 countries, have established to really have the historical context that brought about either slavery, genocide, crimes against humanity. As an example of correcting and repairing the damage of the past, just look at our criminal justice system and mass incarceration of African Americans, disproportionate to our population. As we witness the brutal murder of Mr. George Floyd, and other African Americans throughout, I won't even say the decades, I'd say throughout the centuries. We're witnessing the manifestations once again of systemic racism, which we could trace all the way back to 401 years ago when the first enslaved Africans were brought to America. And so the time is now for us to examine the effects of slavery and understand that and put it into historical context, what we see today as it relates to systemic racism. We have to really look at how our history has impacted the laws and policies of today, because police reform and making policing a real issue around safety in our communities, because it has not been about safety. But when you look at reparations and repairing the damage, I think what our young people are talking about in terms of reimagining policing really is one step forward to making sure that we have communities which are safe for African Americans and people of color. And so we want to make sure that we have this historical context of slavery and the enslaved Africans who built this country for over 250 years. To put in historical context of what we see today and what we know as it relates to police murders, the disproportionate rates of COVID-19, healthcare disparities, the wage gap, the wealth gap. You know all of the issues that systemic racism really reveals. And so we have to have this moment where we tell the truth. We need to put together a process for understanding and healing, and then move toward transformation, which of course the transformation means disrupting and dismantling systemic racism and building a country based on racial justice and racial equity. So therein lies the rationale for reparations. And reparations can take many forms, but we remember the point is to repair the damage. And so thank goodness we're moving forward with HR 40 in the Congress. California has just passed a reparations bill. So we're going to be, I think, one of the first states that's going to have on record a commission to look at and how to develop reparations. And so this is not about holding individuals responsible. This is about holding a system of government responsible for systemically and structurally discriminating and excluding and oppressing African Americans. And so we have to unpack that system that we have in this country and rebuild it based on fairness and justice. And so in rebuilding this, HR 40 and reparations is essential, because we have generations of African Americans who have not been able to acquire wealth. Another form of reparations could be making sure that every African American would be able to own a home and to begin to build wealth for their children and for future generations. We have not had that access in the past. And so once again, the study is extremely important, because once we conduct the study and we know it's needed, we at the same time develop a process that would put forth what reparations would look like in this country. So thank you again very much for inviting me to be with you. And I hope that you would encourage all of your friends, your colleagues, your relatives to ask their members of Congress to support HR 40 and HR 100, because we need to get these bills to the floor. We need to get them passed, and we need to get on with doing the work of repairing the damage of the last 401 years.
Thank you so much, Representative Barbara Lee, for those remarks. For everyone at home, I'm Danielle Belton, Editor-in-Chief of The Root, and I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion. I'd like to bring in our panelists, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, the Chief Race, Wealth, and Community for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and Keith Young, City Councilman from Asheville, North Carolina. Welcome, guys. Oh, you both need to unmute yourselves.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad to have you both. So my first question is for Dedrick. Many people don't realize the full extent of the African-American contribution to generational wealth, health, and the overall success of this country. And we're not talking a few $1 billion, but trillions of dollars. Some reports as much as 94 trillion of labor taken from us since the advent of slavery. What would America be without the forced contributions of Black people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've helped highlight that in the question. I mean, clearly that the economy of the United States was based on enslavement and was based on the appropriation of not just African people, but of indigenous people's land, right? And that is the basis of not just, agricultural industry, which was, very strong in the South around cotton and these types of things, but also it was the basis of a lot of finance in the North, and even manufacturing, because cotton was made into things, and even the insurance industry in New England. A lot of the wealth was made in importing and exporting, well, I guess importing human beings, from usually the Caribbean, from the triangle trade from West Africa. So it was a holistic forced contribution, and it's a contribution that really built all strands of the American economy. But what I would look at is, I don't look at reparations as so much, well, they took $50,000 or $50 trillion, and so we need $50 trillion back. I look at it to repair, right? To bridge the inequality that we have today. And I, like many others, see that wealth and racial wealth inequality is probably one of the best indicators of inequality. And I've done some back of the napkin estimates that African Americans have about $3 trillion of wealth, but to have, what we would have as part of our demographic representation, for 13% of the country, we have 13% of the wealth, we should have about $13 trillion. So we're talking about how do we, bridge that, add that additional $10 trillion. And that's not just $10 trillion, because what money you get in income doesn't just magically transform to wealth. So usually you need more actual dollars to create wealth than just that 10 trillion. So that is the frame I look at it is how do we bridge this racial wealth inequality today?
Now, when I think about reparations, I often think about what my father has said to me in the past about his family and the legacy that we have, where people basically had their labor stolen from them or were criminally underpaid for the work that they did. And so my father, would jokingly say that every raise that he got, he felt like he deserved it, not just for himself, but for his mother and father and those who came before him all deserved this money because they were so grossly underpaid for the work that they did do in the past. My father was able to use that money to put forth in home ownership, in my education and my sister's education. So when we look at reparations, do we consider things like the housing crisis, our educational disparities, health disparities as part of the reparations discussion?
Yes, I mean, again, I think that's why I really do look at this idea of repair, right? And even though I'm focused on wealth in our capitalist economy is so foundational to every other economic or socio-economic indicator, whether it's education or health, and two, you're helping highlight, we're not just talking about what happened a couple hundred years ago. There was forced labor after slavery, right? In the South and even arguably in the North. There is still today devaluation of African-American homes as compared to white homes, right? There is the kind of ghettoization of African-Americans and of ghettoization of skills that keeps us underpaid. So all of those things need to be brought together and looking at what it requires to repair. Because I think once we do repair and we have greater wealth equity, a lot of these other indicators of inequality will diminish.
Now, Keith, you're currently tackling the issue of reparations on a local level. Is that the path forward for many African Americans who have long been disenfranchised by the communities that they live in?
I believe it's a beginning for a pathway forward. This isn't just a city of Asheville issue and my local municipality. These are basically issues that local municipalities and diverse communities across this country have to wrestle with through a larger context within American history. And what has happened throughout that history brings us to this very point in time, which ultimately, we are at a precipice where action needs to occur on a federal level and state levels, because local governments, as such, where I work, can't go it alone. And, I personally want generations to be made whole through systemic action, the same systemic action that got us here and basically has produced policies that have outlived many dead politicians and generations of Black Americans. So in tackling this issue, you know, I do believe that it's a beginning for a pathway forward, definitely.
And, you know, what did it take for you to get, you know, your city to even consider this conversation around reparations? And is it a model that other communities could follow?
Well, you know, in this moment, we have a lot of issues as a country to deal with that affect all citizens. But moreover, I think the death of George Floyd has been the catalyst to the nation's largest civil rights movement that we're witnessing, and a movement that is supported by Black Americans, but also by white allies of the Black community. With that said, what we did doesn't have to be replicated in the same manner, but it can define how other local governments move forward. You know, there are a few key ingredients needed to make the recipe work. Some variables that are in the political realm, you know, can't be accounted for because every space across this country is different. What works in my community might not work somewhere else. I think, you know, the way that we approach it, you have to have a champion. You have to have a political leader, someone who is willing to be a leader in the sense of reparations may not be completely 100% ready to be implemented, but that leader has to be able to step out on a limb and sometimes disappoint their constituencies at a rate that they can absorb. And so you have to have a convener where what I did was there's a retired professor of liberal arts and culture here in our city who had over 20 years of data based on some of the disparities specifically to our area. I also partnered with local activists. And so we had to kind of form sort of a guerrilla warfare tactic team that was very, very small, that I could approach our council with the resolution that we came up with and pretty much, you know, tell folks, hey, this is the political hill that I go die on. Feel free to come die with me if you're against it. But you have to be able to be straightforward. You have to understand the political ground in your area. And you have to have a convener, a champion, to be able to bring a small group of people together that can organize very quickly and make these things happen.
Oh, those are all excellent, excellent advice there for people who want to try to replicate this in their own communities. My next question is for both of you. Which is more obtainable, the community-based model that we've just finished discussing that kind of addresses systemic racism and economic inequalities, or is there something on the federal level that we could be doing, or is it some combination of the both?
I will jump in, and yeah, I think definitely we want to be working on both areas, right? And in some local communities, it might be more doable to pass some type of bill like a HR 40 to create a committee to investigate reparations, or reparations can be such a broad thing, and we're talking a lot about actual financial reparations, some type of investment, but some people also talk about reparations in terms of apologies, in terms of monuments, these types of things. So there's a whole different, there's a large realm of what reparations can be. And so in some local communities, you might be able to get support for some aspect of reparations, but it's clear to me that without national reparations, that includes massive investments, we're not going to get that repair, which I'm looking for. But I do think the local models can show us what is doable, how to help move consciousness forward, and that is not some crazy radical action, but it's something that communities across the country are already engaging in.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would totally agree with that. I think, you know, when you look at, you know, what's more obtainable, I would say, you know, we've had folks around this country that have studied reparations and worked on reparations in theory for an extended period of time. And we at this moment have to move from theory to practice. So I would say any model that's obtainable in your local community to help push forward, quote unquote, the consciousness of the matter, as the gentleman stated, it would be, you know, somewhere to start. I think when you look at where we are going to have some sort of federal investment to make this thing work. As I stated earlier, local governments can't go it alone. But for the most part, you have to be able to move the needle. And that's something that we haven't been able to do in a very long time, ever, so to speak. We've got the bill, the HR 40 bill that's in Congress, that's been there for quite an extended period of time. And Representative from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, who's picked up that torch and that mantle to try to move the ball forward. So I think, a community-based model works. I think whatever you can get done in your community helps push forward the overall aspect of reparations. So.
And I just want to add to that. I know I started off. I just want to add, to me, it is crazy, the idea that we can't pass nationally HR 40. Because HR 40 isn't even reparations. It's just a committee to look at inequality and talk about what are the options of reparations. So, and one positive aspect is that many of the Democrats who were running for president last year actually endorsed HR 40, which is something that hadn't happened in the past. So there's little steps of progress happening at the national level. HR 40 won't be reparations, but it really should be something we can at least do to help further move the ball, as people like Mr. Young and other local leaders are moving the ball, in their areas as well.
Now, what's keeping our political leaders from having this conversation on a national level? What are some of the impediments to what we want to see take place here?
If you don't mind, I'd love to jump in.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sure. I think, politically, it has to be, for some folks, it has to be the right mix. There is a lot of apprehension depending on who you represent and where you're representing them at. I don't think that for a large segment of individuals around this country, reparations is something that they want to see. There's all sorts of things that go into the apprehension of a political person who's in office, who wants to stay in office, that they have to wrestle with. And so I think it's all based on, the old saying that all politics is local. I think that has a lot to do with it. But I think as we continue to move this forward, in local municipalities across the country, and maybe some state governments might take this up, it helps become a bit more palatable regardless of where you stand on the issue, because ultimately you have to have a majority in Congress and the Senate and the president that's willing to do some meaningful change to make this thing happen.
Yeah, and I'll put forward, I think on an optimistic note, which I'm not known for, I'm known for being fairly pessimistic, but on an optimistic note, I think that many people, particularly white people, have associated reparations with punishing white people today for something that happened in the past. I think there's becoming a greater acceptance of this idea of reparations as we're getting clearer. We're not talking about punishing people today for something that happened in the past, but dealing with a contemporary problem that needs to be addressed and how we're going to heal that inequality. So it's not about punishment, it's about fixing a problem. And everyone of all political stripes now at least say they want an equal opportunity society where race doesn't hinder you. So there should be, if we have that framing of reparations is to repair, not to punish, it should be something that more and more people should be able to get on board with.
I'm glad you brought up that point about how the perception that people have of reparations as in it's punishing someone, as opposed to just bringing equality and leveling a playing field that has been grossly unfair since the founding of this nation. When we look at, Dedrick, you kind of talked about this, some of the different forms that reparation could take place in, whether it's monetary, whether it's symbolic, whether it's a conversation like how they did in South Africa, where they have the Truth and Reconciliation Committees. This is for actually both of you, where do you kind of stand on what is necessary in order to repair the damage that has been done to the Black community in this country?
Mr. Young wants to go first. Do you want me to go first?
You can go for it.
Okay, I'll go for it. So I would, I'm fairly materialist in that you know, I think it can be great to have some conversations, and I've supported, there's a documentary made about 10, 12 years ago called Traces of the Trade, which looked at a white family and their ancestors who were some of the leading slave traders in the country, and they were out of Connecticut. And, you know, looked at the traces of trade, and they've done this whole roundtable discussion on race relations. So, and I think it's really important to distinguish between discussing race relations and discussing race repair, right? And, you know, there's place for both, but I just want to make sure that I do believe that it is, you know, economics, investments in communities that are that are maintaining inequality. It is good if we had better relations, and so we should have conversations, but I'm much more focused on the economic investment. And I do think part of that is to create an economic investment that will address the problem. We have to understand the problem, and part of that will be an understanding of history. So I do think we have to have a kind of understanding of, again, racial inequality not just being about race relations, but about institutions, structures that have created deep socioeconomic inequality that still exists today. And now if we're going to address that, we have to create some new structures to actually have a more equal society.
Keith, did you have some thoughts?
Sure. You know, I think, you know, Black people in this country, we're dealing with issues that are systemic in nature. Reparations is a very complex issue, and it requires a solution that looks beyond, you know, a one-time payment or check. I think, you know, when we did this here in Asheville, there are a lot of folks who said, you know, what you all set out to do isn't reparations. The economic part of it, giving someone an actual check, hadn't occurred. Now, we didn't exclude that in our resolution and explicitly, so that can still happen. I think what has to happen is, you know, if we want to give monetary reparations to individuals around this country, we have to make sure that the bank is willing to cash the check. And what I mean by that is, you know, we need to be made whole in so many different areas where Black Americans have great disparities. I mean, healthcare, education, employment, criminal justice, business ownership, home ownership, overall equity, and of course, generational wealth. I think one of the main highlights of that in the moment that we're in right now with COVID-19 is the major health disparities in the Black community. So the folks who contract the coronavirus and actually die from it due to the lack of the healthcare system that you know, Black Americans aren't invested in a way that make us whole. And so we have to fix the system that's broken. You know, actually, let me take that back. It's not broken. It works exactly how it was meant to work. We have to embed systemics in these things so that when monetary reparations comes out of it, you know, the bank will cash that check because the system will then be set up to work for those folks as well, if that makes sense to y'all.
No, that does make sense. I want to open this up to some questions that I've just received from our audience. So thank you for all of you who have submitted questions. The first one is, how can we make sure that throughout the process of implementing reparations, Black communities are trusted and involved in leading the work of where and how reparations should be distributed?
Yeah, and I think part of that is, and actually I'd be interested to hear how it was done at the local level. I know in HR 40, I mean, that's part of the reason why you need a committee to investigate reparations, and in kind of theories about how this reparations would occur, there would also be a committee as to how this would be implemented. And of course, it would be essential that African Americans are well represented, I would say majority represented, and African Americans who actually have serious understanding and knowledge of not just the history, but of the contemporary issues and what type of investments could actually move these things forward. So it's going to be, you know, essential that the committees that coordinate this are predominantly African American and have knowledge in the areas we're looking to address.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you know, when you look at, you know, how can the community be involved and what redress happens, yeah, how can they be made whole? I think, you know, they have to be at the table. And regardless of where you're at, if you are in a community where your local elected officials or your state government is trying to implement reparations, I'm pretty sure you're going to have a group of individuals that are going to be very excited and very proactive about making their voice heard, to tell you what specifically they want. I think there has to be some basic groundwork laid, out in whatever bill or legislation that you do to address some of the disparities that I mentioned earlier. But for the most part, the community that you do this in is going to have proactive activists and community leaders and people who are willing to be involved to tell you, as an elected official or whomever is in the position to implement reparations, this is how we need to be made whole, aside from all the other things that you may be wanting to do in your local legislation or bill.
Okay. For our next question, we have, how, if at all, does the movement to defund police forces and transfer the money into community development intersect with reparations?
If you don't mind, I'll talk about that, because we just, here in my city, just last night at a council meeting, we began the process where we reallocated 3% of our police budget. I will say this, I think the defund the police and the intersection of reparations has a lot to do with the fact of the disparities that continue to occur in this country for Black Americans. I think, again, these systemic issues that we're dealing with have been embedded for an extended period of time that bring us to the point to where, folks are out marching in the streets. George Floyd catalyzed the movement, and we see Black men and women being killed at the hands of police. Pretty much, we can't go a month and a half without having someone else in the news. So that intersection occurs with the disparities. I will say this, I would be very careful about how we utilize the money from defunding the police, because in my community, there's a big push to take some of that money and put it over into nonprofits, or try to figure out what the police do and how can someone else do it better. Okay, my thing is with the money is, it doesn't matter where you move the money if the system is still set up to police me as a Black man in the same way, that the outcomes will remain the same. Meaning, we can defund the police all we want, we can move the money all we want, but when I leave a council meeting, I'm still going to get pulled over, and there is a possibility that I could get my head kicked in just based off of the systemic. So we have to be able to figure out, how do we change the way that police me or you as a Black man or woman in this country. But the intersection of those two are based off of the disparities that we've seen through the systemics throughout the history of this country that we're dealing with right now.
And I'll just throw in there that, I think a fundamental aspect of this idea of defunding the police is, to me, defunding white supremacy, right? I mean, I think the idea is that policing has been used in a racist, racialized way to oppress communities. And that's true, and it's not just in policing. It's in housing, right. It's in healthcare, it's in corporate America. So we need to defund all of those things. And it doesn't mean now there's no funding in education or healthcare. No, now we need to refund it in a way that actually is addressing these inequalities. So I think, that fundamental aspect of it is something, that I find positive in helping to deal with these issues of reparations.
Okay. For our next question, how can monetary reparations interact with structural change to truly make things equal or equitable for the Black community? For instance, does getting more money mean people will have more equal experiences in things like education and health? How does monetary reparations fix issues like existing segregation?
I think I mentioned that earlier. When you talk about the systemics that are set up, to prevail in this system. Monetary reparations, in my opinion, aren't going to do, they will do some good. They will do some good. But when you look at trying to sustain generation after generation, let's say we give this generation a great deal of money or whatever. If the systemics remain the way that they are, it's probably going to be good chance that your future offspring and great grandkids are going to be back in the same position, because even though you gave us a check to cash, the systemic still persisted that allowed us to be in this situation that we're currently in. And apparently it has a good track record of working for over 400 years, because we're still in this same position despite the major gains that Black Americans have made in this country, regardless of the systemics, which I think is admirable for us to begin with. But we've got to break down the system that we're dealing with right now, with all these major disparities again in healthcare and housing and education and the wealth gap and so on.
Yeah, and you know, some people are dismissive of this idea of writing a check. I'm not. Like, I wrote a piece in The Guardian about $20,000 a year for 20 years for African Americans as part of the reparations package, because again, I am dismissive of $20,000 and you're done, and that's supposed to repair racial economic inequality, right? No, that's not going to repair racial economic inequality. And even $20,000 over 20 years probably isn't enough. We need some other things as well. But the reason I wrote this is that I wanted to highlight that it takes time. Like, giving someone one infusion of money is not going to solve what's been happening for generations. It takes time to when you first get the money, you're going to be dealing with, immediate needs, right? And debts that you've had, or maybe trying to find an apartment in a better place. But it's only over time that you're going to be able to use that money to actually invest in capital and get returns in. You're not going to do that the first year or the second year. So we have to be clear, this reparations is going to be long-term. Even if checks are written, it's not going to be, and well, at least I don't think it should be a one check. It has to be over time, because it was over time we got in this situation.
I would just, before you go on to the next question, those are very good points. I would agree with all of that. I would also say one of my major concerns was that, for our bill locally here, to not have local government or anyone who wanted to replicate that say, because you got a check, our obligation to the Black community is done. Meaning, if you don't fix the systemics, even if you continue to give the check, people might say, our obligation to you is done. Everything is well and good now. Kind of like, when we elected President Obama, there's no more racism in America. We elected a Black president. It doesn't work that way. And so I agree with everything the gentleman said earlier, but just wanted to add that point as well.
No, it was an excellent point. I'm a strong believer that it's going to take more than just writing a check and then just wiping your hands of the issue. Like, that's just not a realistic approach, considering it took us hundreds and hundreds of years to get into this situation. For our next question, how do the panelists suggest addressing race relations, particularly when it comes to poor white people who racism is not tied to their access to wealth?
Sure. Well, I think if you're talking about helping poor whites in asset poverty, generally, we're probably not talking about reparations unless you're talking about some particular group that had some historic wrong to them. I don't know, that particular community you're talking about. I mean, there has been reparations for Jewish, people around the world, right? Because they did have wrongs done to them, and different Europeans have had wrong to them. But because you're for reparations doesn't mean that I also don't support programs that help poor people of all race that didn't suffer racism or what have you. So I'm for very progressive policies. I'm for, everything from full employment to individual development accounts to, free community college, all of these things that I think will help poor people or disenfranchised people of all communities. We just recognize that I think the key point about reparations, and someone had sent the email too about indigenous people, and I think there's a huge space for Native American reparations as well, though our focus right now is African American reparations. That there's a lot of policy that needs to be set forth to deal with the broad issues, but reparations recognize that there is a particular acts done against particular people that need to be addressed, and that is where we're dealing with reparations. But I'm for a much broader progressive policy that brings back an economic mobility that we haven't seen even for white people in about 40 or 50 years. This has been a very regressive economy.
I think the gentleman laid it out very well in what he said. I think, you know, when you look at that, it's one of those, I think there's a great deal of Americans that promote social economic policy that will uplift everybody, no matter whether you're black, white, red, yellow, or blue. I think in the instance of reparations, you know, there's the saying that a rising tide lifts all boats, but I say a rising tide only lifts all boats if all boats are prepared to ride the wave. And I think when you talk about reparations to Black America, we're not prepared to ride the wave, because the opportunity that we have set out in front of us has not been unabated. It has been with obstruction. It has been with roadblocks, and it has been something that we've had to overcome as an extra step that requires equity in the system. And so, you know, I always tell myself it's not up for me to educate folks who may feel that way. There's a great deal of history in this country that goes back a long time. For instance, I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but I do want to say this. You know, back in 1860, the United States had, I think, nearly 4 million slaves, and translated in today's dollars, probably about, those slaves were worth about $3 billion. The value of those slaves combined was greater than every asset of every financial institution, every factory, every railroad during this period. And so America has been catalyzed, the economic superpower that it is, by Black Americans, Black individuals. And so when you go back and you look at that thorough history, from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to all the different things that have happened to Black Americans, even the Homeowners Loan Corporation back in the 1930s and 40s, when you start talking about generational wealth, we've been given opportunity, but our opportunity always comes with an asterisk. And so individuals who may have a bias about, you know, why should you get reparations and not me? I think you have to look at the history of it and understand that, you know, there's a great deal of Americans who promote social economic policy that supports everyone. But in this instance, we've got to make sure that all boats on this situation are ready to ride the wave.
Okay. And I think we have time for one final question. This one is directed to Councilmember Young. Can you say more about the recently passed resolution and your city manager's role in determining short, medium, and long-term plans? How will the city manager work with the commission?
Well, in our city, we've got it set up right now where we have a specific Department of Equity and Inclusion. And their job is specifically to look at instances such as this where they can plug in. Our city manager and our equity department will work hand in hand to bring forth suggestions, but this commission is set up in a way that it's made for other municipalities in our county to join in, which some have already. It's set up for private entities and businesses to join in, leaders around the community to join in, and figure out a way together how to move forward with community input. So there are sort of two different tracks that are working. There's the internal track from our local government that's going to be looking specifically on how we can implement a reparations program, but there's also going to be the external, the community working together to figure out how they can also be a big part of that as well.
Thank you so much. So we are out of time. We have talked so much, and there's so much important information, and I'm glad that we were able to be part of this conversation. I want to thank everyone who attended this discussion, and a special thank you to Representative Barbara Lee, to Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, Keith Young, and the NYU Wagner and the Century Foundation team. Again, a recording of this will be made available within 48 hours following the event on tcf.org and wagner.nyu.edu, where you can learn more about future events as well. Thank you, everyone. I'm Danielle Belton from The Root, and I'm glad you could join us.